When I talk to people about watercolor, the most common response is that it's hard to work with. And I agree, to a level of difficulty, until you learn how it works. And a lot of it boils down to the pigment and how it moves around. Let's compare acrylic paint and watercolor paint just for a minute. The way that acrylic paint is made is by having a hue of pigment, and its binder is a type of plastic called acrylic polymer. When you put this combination of pigment and binder on your brush and apply it to your painting surface, it sticks. The reason is because it's a polymer hitting a dry surface and it just sticks. Acrylic painting is mainly a dry-on-dry painting method, which means it's paint being applied to a dry surface. With watercolor, it's made up of a pigment and a binder called gum arabic.
Gum arabic is the natural gum originally consisting of the hardened sap of two species of the acacia tree. This gum is water soluble and even used in the food industry. Have you ever heard of gummy candies or gummy bears?
Usually one will take this combination on their brush, add a little water, and apply it to the surface. Now if the surface is dry, the paint sticks just like any other. But if the surface is wet, which is typical in watercolor painting, the pigment starts to move around wherever it can find water or a dampness. This is a process that we typically call wet on wet. That means that there's a good amount of water on the paint and also a good amount of water on the painting surface, hence the term wet on wet. The more water that's on the paper, the more the pigment moves, making it harder to control. That's the difference between painting with watercolor and other painting mediums, is that it's a little bit harder to control. But with the right instruction and practice, you're going to come to find out that it's really not that hard to control. Let's take a look at an example.
In our example here, let's take a look at the circle as our boundary. If I take the acrylic paint and start applying it within the lines, for the most part it stays. As I wet the surface within the boundary and apply the paint, it moves, but not without much control.
Now let's take a look at it from a watercolorist perspective.
Let's do the same thing. We have our line for our boundary. If I take some watercolor paint and apply it to the dry paper, let's see what happens. The paint and the pigment stays within our boundary, unless there has been a little water that's went outside the lines. Now let's wet the surface within the boundary and apply the paint again, and see what happens. As the pigment hits into the wet spots, it wants to flow a little bit more freely than the acrylic does.
As with any painting medium, to master it, you have to learn control in how to apply the paint. This applies to any medium. For watercolor, here's the basic rule of control. The more of the water that's on the surface, more of the pigment is going to spread out. The trick to learning this is just learning the right combination of wet and dry combination on your brush and the wet and dry combination on your painting surface. This also applies to your brush. The more water that's on your brush, the more that pigment's going to want to move around. The final point to get across in this segment is the less water that's on the pigment, the more brighter or more vibrant the color is going to be on your paper. As you add water, it will make your paint less vibrant and more transparent. You'll see more of this when we get into our tutorials. In the next segment, we're going to cover the different types of brushes and the ones that you should use.